Good day, everyone. Last week of classes, which means, of course, final exams just around the corner. So watch Quercus for announcements about the final exam period and things like that. Office hours, style, coverage, and all those sorts of things. As usual, I hope that wherever you are, you're staying safe and sound and enjoying the spring weather. Although here in Toronto this week, the weather's kind of like the letter W. The temperature goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Anyway, but I'm not complaining. I'm just stating facts. I'm enjoying the spring. Okay? So what are we doing today? Well, we're doing part 2 of our discussion about the open economy in terms of how we integrate this into macro models. And so an outline of things we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about exchange rates is our key issue or topic that integrates all of the stuff we're going to speak about today. We're going to talk about exchange rate policy. We're going to talk about the choice that each country has. Do you want to adopt a flexible exchange rate, sometimes called a floating exchange rate? That's an exchange rate that's allowed to freely float up and down on financial markets. Or do you want to adopt a fixed exchange rate? See, these are very different approaches. Okay? Most countries in the world, free to choose whichever one they feel is most suitable for them. There's no one right answer here as to which is the best exchange rate policy. Some countries feel fixed exchange rates is best for them, and they adopt fixed exchange rates. Other countries feel flexible exchange rates is the best policy for them, and they've adopted a flexible exchange rate. Like I say, there's no one size fits all kind of solution or answer here. What's best for one need not be best for another country. And so we're going to talk about the exchange rate regime. Again, either a flexible exchange rate regime or a fixed exchange rate regime, and what that exchange rate regime means for macro policy. If you have a floating exchange rate or a flexible exchange rate, what does that mean for fiscal policy? What does that mean for monetary policy? Does it make those policies operate the same way, or does it alter how those policies change the economy? And indeed, it turns out that the exchange rate regime matters for how macro policy gets filtered out into the economy, because now the exchange rate is another issue that might fluctuate, especially in the case of a flexible exchange rate. And so how we address macroeconomic policy, the impacts of macroeconomic policy, are dependent upon the exchange rate regime we have. So fiscal policy has a particular way it works in the open economy. It alters the exchange rate perhaps, and therefore there's another channel there for the fiscal policy to influence the macroeconomy. So we'll speak about the power, or lack thereof, of fiscal policy and monetary policy, either with a flexible exchange rate regime or a fixed exchange rate regime. It turns out the choice of the exchange rate regime matters for how powerful policy is or is not in the short run for our open economy. So, let's dive into this stuff. So we'll start with the notion of exchange rate policy. Because when you have an open economy, your country has its own currency, and your country is free to choose what kind of exchange rate policy you would like to have. So an exchange rate regime is a rule or policy towards the exchange rate. There are 2 major exchange rate regimes we've already highlighted: the floating or flexible exchange rate regime and the fixed exchange rate regime. With the floating or flexible exchange rate regime, the exchange rate is determined by market forces. So an example of a floating exchange rate environment or situation is the relationship between the Canadian and American dollar. On foreign exchange markets, the Canadian dollar freely floats, as does the American dollar. And so the exchange rate between these two nations is flexible, and it floats, and it rises and falls over the course of the day or over the course of a week, over the course of time. the exchange rate is floating. It's kind of like going down to Lake Ontario and inflating a beach ball and then bouncing that beach ball out onto the surface of the lake. If the lake is really calm and placid, then the water is just sitting there at one level and the beach ball just floats on the surface calmly. But if the lake is disturbed, if there are big waves up and down, then that beach ball is floating up and down as the level of the surface of the water rises and falls. Right? So again, a floating exchange rate, the exchange rate being determined by market forces, just like the height of that ball is being determined by whether the lake is just calm and flat or whether the waves are rising and falling. Right? We let that thing freely float. A fixed exchange rate regime, the exchange rate is being held fixed at some pre-chosen level. So in a fixed exchange rate regime, the exchange rate regime means that we have a particular rule that says, we have some target exchange rate that the government has picked, and then we do what we need to do to keep the exchange rate at that target, to keep it fixed. Examples of fixed exchange rate regimes include jurisdictions like Hong Kong or China proper. Right? China has a fixed exchange rate. China's exchange rate is fixed against the American dollar. Bulgaria, the Bulgarian lek, I believe, is fixed. Denmark has fixed their exchange rate. But in Europe, there are a number of countries with fixed exchange rates, including, of course, the Euro bloc. Every country in the Euro bloc has a fixed exchange rate. A German euro is the same as a French euro or an Italian euro, because a euro is a euro is a euro. And so all the countries in the Euro group have fixed exchange rates with each other. They've abandoned their unique national currencies that they used to have in the past. You know, the French franc is gone. The German mark is gone. The Italian lira is gone. And they've been replaced by a common currency, a fixed exchange rate between all of these nations. And so an exchange rate regime, a rule or a policy towards the exchange rate. In the case of the Euro bloc, all the countries that have joined the Euro bloc have chosen to fix their exchange rates together, to have a common currency. Within Canada, all of the territories and provinces are part of a currency union in some sense, because we all use the Canadian dollar. We don't have a separate currency in Quebec than we have in Ontario or in Alberta or in Nunavut. We have the Canadian dollar used throughout the Canadian Federation. Okay? So within Canada, within the different jurisdictions and territories and provinces, we have fixed exchange rates within the nation. But externally, against other nations, the Canadian dollar floats against other sovereign jurisdictions like the United States. Okay? So again, those are our two major types. We either choose a target exchange rate and do what we need to do to keep the exchange rate fixed there, have a fixed exchange rate regime, or we let the exchange rate float and let the market decide where the exchange rate is. Okay? Let me borrow the overhead here a little bit. And so let's draw a picture of the foreign exchange market. So here's our foreign exchange market. This is the quantity of domestic currency being exchanged, and this is the nominal exchange rate. And so we have the supply of domestic currency and the demand for domestic currency. So again, S for supply, DC for domestic currency. D for demand, DC for domestic currency. So this is the quantity of domestic currency being exchanged. And I'll sneak that upstairs here. And I'll mention the flexible exchange rate regime. With a flexible exchange rate regime, wherever supply intersects demand, that determines the exchange rate in equilibrium. And any shift of the demand curve or any shift of the supply curve will put pressure on that exchange rate to fluctuate. And since the exchange rate is allowed to be flexible, the exchange rate will float up or down, depending upon supply or demand conditions. So market conditions. Locate the supply and demand curves. And therefore, determine the short run equilibrium nominal exchange rate. Okay? So again, that's the so-called flexible exchange rate regime. And it's market forces determining the amount of demand for the domestic currency on the foreign exchange market and the amount being supplied. Market forces are locating those curves and therefore determining that short-run equilibrium exchange rate. So that's the exchange rate in the short run here in equilibrium. All right? Let's draw another picture here. Again, quantity domestic currency, nominal exchange rate. We're back with the foreign exchange market. But now we're going to look at the fixed exchange rate. With the fixed exchange rate, the government chooses a target exchange rate. The government says, look at that exchange rate right there. That's our desired or target exchange rate. And we want this exchange rate to happen. So a fixed exchange rate regime sees the government picking that target or desired exchange rate and promising to make this exchange rate happen. So the government promises to do whatever is required to make that target exchange rate occur. So if our demand curve for domestic currency is here, then in essence, the government has promised to push the supply curve here. Thereby making the equilibrium between supply and demand right on target. And the exchange rate has stayed fixed. If either the supply curve or the demand curve shifts, putting the intersection between supply and demand away from target, then the government has agreed here in sort of step 2 to do whatever they need to do to push the intersection back onto this line. So again, if the demand curve were to shift up to the right, putting upward pressure on the exchange rate so the nominal exchange rate appreciates, they go, oh my gosh, the nominal exchange rate appreciates. Well, we'd have to shift the supply curve over to the right to push the equilibrium back down to target. Demand shifted right, we'd need to shift supply to the right. So the central bank would have to go out and sell domestic currency. That's shifting the supply curve, because that's the selling of domestic currency, shifting it this way. An offsetting shift. Okay? So let me draw that. So there's our target. And initially, we're right here at point A. Yay, everything's okay. But then, there's an increase in demand. Shifting the demand curve to D prime, up and over to the right, putting pressure on the exchange rate to appreciate above the fixed exchange rate target. But the central bank says, we can't have that. We're supposed to have this fixed exchange rate regime. So the central bank intervenes by shifting the supply curve to take us right there, to push us back to target. Shift 1 is offset by shift 2. We end up at point C, back at the target exchange rate. So if demand for domestic currency increases, that's shift number 1. This puts pressure on the nominal exchange rate to appreciate. There's a nominal appreciation from A to B. The nominal exchange rate appreciated. The central bank, so CB for central bank, has to intervene and increase supply. Of domestic currency. There's too much demand, too many people buying domestic currency, not enough sellers, so the central bank sells. When the central bank is selling domestic currency, that means they're buying foreign currency. Because we're exchanging one currency for the other. The central bank's going out to the foreign exchange market, selling our currency, and exchanging it for foreign currency. Okay? And that's our shift number 2. In the end, there's no change in the exchange rate. It stays fixed. It's a very different circumstance when you have a fixed exchange rate regime. Earlier, when we had the flexible exchange rate regime, a shift of the demand curve, that would have been it. It just, the exchange rate would have appreciated and we would have went, oh, well, what do you know? Because the exchange rate's allowed to float. It's flexible. So with the flexible exchange rate regime, these market forces that shift supply and demand around make the exchange rate float. But with a fixed exchange rate regime, supply and demand have to intersect on target. Any market force that shifts one of these curves has to be offset by the central bank. The central bank makes an offsetting shift to keep the exchange rate fixed, to stay on target. Okay. What we just showed is related to this passage here. How can the exchange rate be held fixed? Right? Under the fixed exchange rate regime, the central bank has that obligation. Remember, we wrote down there were 2 steps there. They choose the target exchange rate, and they promise to make the target happen. That's that obligation. So they have the obligation to maintain the exchange rate at the official target level. If the current market exchange rate deviates away from the official target, the central bank has to intervene. They have to make an offsetting shift to ensure the market exchange rate goes back to the target rate. It's kind of like saying, in my apartment, I have a policy to keep the air temperature 20 degrees Celsius. But yet, I never turn on the air conditioning unit in the summer. I never turn on the furnace in the winter. And in fact, in the winter, I have the windows open. Well, that's a policy that's just a bunch of noise because I'm not doing anything to actually enforce that policy. With a fixed exchange rate policy, you choose that target exchange rate and you promise to do what you have to do to make it happen. Right? So the central bank can maintain that fixed exchange rate through a number of different tools. Foreign exchange rate market intervention, that's what we showed in the diagram. We did an offsetting shift. They adjust their holdings of official reserves. That's foreign currency denominated assets held by the central bank. In the example we saw earlier, right here, the central bank caused this shift. They sold domestic currency and they accumulated foreign currency. They're accumulating more foreign currency reserves. That's a foreign exchange market intervention. They intervene directly into the foreign exchange market to alter the outcome. They can also adjust the money supply using other methods, such as going out into the bond market and buying and selling bonds, so-called open market operations. If I buy or sell bonds, I'm altering the price of bonds, I'm altering the yield on the bonds, and I'm altering the amount of money in circulation. If I buy bonds, I'm sending more money out into circulation, so the money supply is growing. If I sell bonds, I'm taking money out of circulation, and the money supply is shrinking. So open market operations, the open market purchase and sale of bonds, alters the money supply, alters the prices on bonds and the yield, the nominal interest rate on them, and that can change the exchange rate through financial capital flows. Because when the nominal interest rate in the country rises or falls, financial capital either flows inwards or outwards, depending on whether the nominal interest rate went up or went down. If the nominal interest rate rises, then domestic financial investments look more desirable and financial capital flows inwards. If the domestic nominal rate of interest falls, then domestic financial assets look less good compared to foreign financial assets, and financial capital flows outwards. Okay? And that will alter the exchange rate because of those capital flows. Thirdly, and this is one that we don't tend to do very much, or most countries don't do this, is the central bank can maintain the fixed exchange rate by imposing capital controls, limitations on the amount of financial capital that can flow inwards or outwards. Canada tends not to do that, but some countries do. You know, in some countries, the nation's residents are told on an annual basis the most you're allowed to port out of the country is, 50,000 American dollars and not any more. To do more than that would be breaking the law. And so you can impose limitations on the flow of financial capital, thereby imposing limitations then on where the exchange rate might go. Okay? Of these three, the first one, the foreign exchange market intervention, is the most commonly used method to maintain a fixed exchange rate. And so we're going to assume the central bank will use this method to keep the exchange rate at target if we have a fixed exchange rate regime. Okay? So, like in our example earlier, here's a similar picture, but already filled in. If we started at A, where demand was D1 and supply is S1, and there's our fixed exchange rate, and we're right on target, if suddenly there's an increase in demand, putting upward pressure on the exchange rate, then the central bank is forced to shift the supply curve. So here, the central bank is selling domestic currency at the fixed target rate, right? So they're selling domestic currency at that target rate, and they're buying foreign currency in return because they're selling domestic in exchange for foreign at that target rate. By setting it at that target rate, we're assured that the supply curve shifts all the way to point B. Not part way, not too far, just the right amount. We set the price at which we're willing to trade, and just enough transactions happen. The end result will be then that the money supply is rising because we're selling domestic currency, so the money supply is growing, and our official reserves will be rising. We'll now be holding more foreign exchange reserves because we're buying foreign currency. That's why this is rising. We're having more foreign currency in the central bank vault. We're selling domestic currency, and that's why the money supply is growing. You'll notice they're both going in the same direction because this represents an increase of foreign currency reserves in the central bank's vault, and this one, an increase in domestic currency out in circulation, and that happened because the central bank was selling domestic currency. The measures of the money supply, whether we use M1 or M2 or whatever, none of the measures of the money supply include domestic currency in the central bank's vault that is owned by the central bank. But when the central bank does this shift, right, when they sell domestic currency, now that money's in circulation, the money supply grew. Right? And yes, the exchange rate has been, eased, dropped back down to the fixed exchange rate. Right back down to target. So what we saw in those examples is how the central bank is fixing the exchange rate through a market intervention. Suppose there's our target exchange rate, and suppose for some reason or another, the supply curve for domestic currency on the foreign exchange market and the demand curve for domestic currency in the foreign exchange market intersect here at point A. That's the free market exchange rate. Oh, and that's the official fixed exchange rate. Right? So the official exchange rate, E0, the market exchange rate, E market. At E0, there's an excess supply of domestic currency. Wow, the resolution seems awful. Why is this? On the angle I'm on, it looks really bad. Maybe I should zoom in some more. Sorry, guys. That's a little better. At the official target rate, at the fixed exchange rate, right now with this supply curve and this demand curve, there's an excess supply of domestic currency. At E0, there's the demand and there's the supply. So there's an excess supply of domestic currency. And there's pressure for the domestic currency to depreciate down to the market exchange rate. To keep E at E0 then, the central bank has to buy domestic currency. They're forced to shift the demand curve over to the right, up to here, eliminating the excess supply because demand is now bigger. So the central bank is buying domestic currency. That, of course, means they're selling foreign currency. Because we're buying domestic and we're paying for it with our foreign currency reserves. These are two parts of the same transaction. I'm buying Canadian dollars and I'm selling foreign currencies. And we're shifting the demand curve for domestic currency to the right. When I'm taking domestic currency out of circulation and into my vault, the money supply is dropping. And at the same time, my official foreign currency reserves are declining as well because I'm selling foreign currency. All right? So when you've adopted the fixed exchange rate, it's important for the central bank to choose that target exchange rate appropriately. You don't want it too far above where the demand and supply naturally intersect. You don't want it too far below either, because this creates imbalances. If the target exchange rate is way up here, there's an excess supply because you've overvalued the domestic currency relative to what the market says it's worth. Right? This is the free market exchange rate. Similarly, if you set the target exchange rate down here, then you've got an excess demand. You've undervalued the currency versus what the free market says it's worth. So you don't want to misvalue the currency too much, or right? You don't want to overvalue too much or undervalue too much. You'd rather have that target exchange rate near to or at where the supply and demand usually intersect. Therefore, you're not forced to intervene and manipulate the market too much. Okay? Let's talk about each of these. E1, and that says E2. Right? If the exchange rate is set to E1 as our target exchange rate, then the domestic currency is overvalued relative to the free market exchange rate because that number is bigger than this number. There's pressure for the domestic currency to depreciate back down to the free market exchange rate. And to keep E at E1, the central bank has to buy domestic currency and shift the demand curve up to here. So they're buying domestic currency, selling foreign currency. Official reserves will be declining as we're selling foreign currency, right? And this could result into a dangerous situation. You could get a financial crisis if you sell too much foreign currency reserves. Let me say that again. Earlier, we said a fixed exchange rate regime has us choose a target exchange rate and promise to make the exchange rate occur. To put our money where our mouth is, to follow up on the promise, we need official reserves. How can I promise to buy or sell any amount of domestic currency if I have no ability to buy? In order to buy domestic currency, I need foreign currency reserves. Putting the exchange rate way up here, way above where supply intersects demand, creates that huge overvaluation, right? And eats away a lot of official reserves. It depletes my ability. It diminishes my ability. It's a better word. It diminishes my ability to maintain this fixed exchange rate. If I'm out there, buying domestic currency a lot and selling foreign a lot, my official reserves get worn down and down and down, and that pile is finite. If the pile gets too small, I could have a financial crisis. People could say, Jack's no longer able to maintain his fixed exchange rate. His promise means nothing. And people could attack my currency to force the exchange rate down to something more reasonable. In fact, it might go even lower than this because of the weird exchange rate dynamics this could have. So not necessarily good for the economy. Similarly, if you fix the exchange rate down here at E2, now the domestic currency is undervalued relative to the free market exchange rate. There's pressure for the domestic currency to appreciate back to the free market exchange rate. To keep E at E2, the central bank has to buy foreign currency and sell domestic. They're shifting the supply curve this way to here because they're selling domestic currency. Selling means supplying. They're shifting the supply curve, so the intersection comes here. Right? And when they're selling domestic, they're buying foreign. Hey, they're accumulating more official reserves. And when they're selling domestic, the money supply is growing. In the first case, the money supply was going the other direction. It was dropping. Bottom line, we prefer to have the target closer to where supply naturally intersects demand. Okay? This increase in the money supply down here could be inflationary in the longer term. We don't want this problem where we could have a depletion of our official reserves, where it could lead to an unstable environment, maybe a financial crisis. Similarly, we don't want to be way down here too far and create too much inflation in the longer term. We want reasonable macro outcomes, not just in the short run, also in the longer term. So the dilemma facing the country is, which regime? It's kind of like when you get up in the morning and you say, I'm going to go out today. What clothing should I wear? Should I wear all plaid or should I, mix and match? Is it a good hair day? Do I need a hat? All these things. And so each country gets to choose. Any open economy faces this dilemma. Should we go flexible or should we go fixed? So let's talk about the arguments in favor of a flexible exchange rate. With a flexible exchange rate, the central bank can design and implement its own independent monetary policy. When you have a flexible exchange rate, you're in control of your own money supply. Okay? This avoids the problem of not having enough foreign currency reserves to defend your exchange rate. Right? Remember, to ensure a fixed exchange rate is sustainable in the longer term, the central bank has to have enough foreign exchange reserves. In the case of Canada, I'm not sure the most recent data as to how much official reserves we have in terms of foreign exchange reserves. The last time I looked, we had about $80 billion. Let's put that into perspective. The last time I looked, Hong Kong had some multiple of that, probably 5 times that. And yet the population of Hong Kong is like the population of the Greater Toronto Area. It's a fraction of that of Canada's. But Hong Kong needs a big pile of foreign exchange reserves because they have a fixed exchange rate. Canada does not need a big pile of foreign exchange reserves. We can use those resources and free them up for other uses. Okay? Remember that, like I said, if you have a fixed exchange rate regime and you run out of official reserves, you can have yourselves a currency crisis. Okay? If the central bank tries to maintain a fixed exchange rate through capital controls, this could also lead to inefficient allocation of capital. If the country says you're not able to port financial capital out of our country, or very much of it, then you're keeping more financial capital constrained within the nation, and you're manipulating market prices and interest rates and things like that, and it could lead to misvaluations of real estate or stock on the stock market or whatever, and it could lead to big run-ups of real estate values or stock market values, and perhaps the bubble might burst and you could see people really getting hurt too because of inefficient allocation. If the borders open and the financial capital can go to where it gets the best rate of return, then maybe it goes to a better place, not just in terms of overall rate of return, but risk adjusted. Let's talk about the arguments in favor of a fixed exchange rate regime. When you fix the exchange rate, ignoring the possibility of a financial crisis, which is usually not a big probability, this eliminates or at least reduces uncertainty about the exchange rate in the future. if you're planning on a big vacation a year from now, hoping that a year from now COVID is all behind us and everything's going to be great, and if you book your air flight and your hotel stay and blah, 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 and if your country and the destination country have a fixed exchange rate regime between each other, then you have a certainty as to how much all this stuff costs. But if you have a floating exchange rate regime, and you book but don't pay yet for your hotel, you book and don't pay yet for your rental car and all these kinds of things, when the time comes you actually travel a year from now, the exchange rate may have fluctuated and things might look a lot cheaper than you expected, but they also might look a lot more expensive depending on the direction of the exchange rate movement. And so having the fixed exchange rate reduces uncertainty. And so that promotes more international trade, more international investments. Some of the nations that choose fixed exchange rate regimes will fix their currency against their major trading partners' currency. If my nation is a small nation in the South Pacific, and most of my trade is with New Zealand or Australia, or maybe Japan or the United States, then it might make sense to fix our exchange rate against our major trading partners' currency. So our currency could be fixed against our major trading partners' currency, and that encourages more trade between our nations, more financial investments. Right? If we fix our exchange rate with Australia, then Australian firms are more likely to invest in our economy because our currency is the same as their currency. They're tied together. And so they might build more hotels and infrastructure and whatever. It might lead to more tourism coming from Australia because the Australian currency, because again, that fixed exchange rate. And so we can enjoy then more gains from trade by having that fixed exchange rate. So many of the nations that fix their exchange rate fix on the basis of this to reduce uncertainty. Another reason to fix the exchange rate, fixing the exchange rate ties the hand of the central bank. When you have the floating exchange rate, the first bullet that's now off the screen, the first sort of pause that we said about the floating exchange rate was we have our own independent monetary policy. If you trust the central bank, then they're in control of their own independent monetary policy. Hooray! But if you don't trust the central bank, maybe you want to fix the exchange rate because you're tying the hands of the central bank. It prevents the central bank from running an excessively expansionary monetary policy. Because under the fixed exchange rate, the central bank can't use monetary policy to affect the economy. Monetary policy is busy holding the exchange rate frozen. The choice of exchange rate regime, then, is a choice of monetary policy. This is why we keep talking about the central bank. With the floating exchange rate regime, the central bank is told, let the currency float on the foreign exchange market, and now you're free to control the money supply and do what you want to do with the money supply to maybe target the inflation rate or try and manipulate unemployment or whatever. But if they're told we're adopting the fixed exchange rate regime, they're told you're no longer in control of the money supply. You're going to make the money supply whatever it needs to be to maintain this target exchange rate. And so if we don't have excessively expansionary monetary policy, then maybe we don't have to worry about a runaway inflation, like a hyperinflation. We can still have a hyperinflation under a fixed exchange rate regime. If we fix our currency against the American dollar and the Americans have a hyperinflation, well, guess what? So do we, because we tied our cart to their cart. But if the Americans have a low inflation policy, then we have a low inflation policy also, because our currencies are tied together. Right? So some countries choose a fixed exchange rate regime to get away from an inflationary, expansionary monetary policy. In Argentina, they had a hyperinflation, a massive inflation caused by the central bank printing huge amounts of money under a floating exchange rate regime, using that money to pay off government debts because the government was essentially bankrupt, and basically destroyed the value of the currency. In the end, the central bank stopped printing the money. They got a big bailout from the IMF and the World Bank and all that kind of stuff. And coming out of that hyperinflation, the country adopted a fixed exchange rate, was part of their, going straight or going honest kind of route. Right? It's kind of like, saying, I have a problem, I have an addiction, I'm going to no longer, do that drug or whatever. And so they fixed the exchange rate to remove this possibility of having that inflationary policy. Another argument in favor of a fixed exchange rate regime is fiscal policy becomes more powerful. When the exchange rate is fixed, fiscal policy has extra expansionary or contractionary power on the economy versus the floating exchange rate situation. Let me sneak this back up a minute. Under a flexible exchange rate regime, monetary policy has more power because I control the money supply. Under a fixed exchange rate regime, monetary policy has no power because it's busy keeping the exchange rate fixed. But under the flexible exchange rate regime, fiscal policy has less power than it does over here. So again, monetary is more powerful with flexible, less powerful with fixed. Fiscal policy is more powerful with fixed exchange rates, less powerful with flexible. You can't win. You can't have, one exchange rate regime that makes both fiscal and monetary policy more effective. Okay. So let's take a look at some issues related to how this plays out. Okay? So we're going to connect the exchange rate and macro policy together. Okay? We'll start by continuing to talk about a fixed exchange rate situation. So I highlight that heavily. In a fixed exchange rate environment, there's some special vernacular that comes into play now. And that's the notion of devaluation and revaluation. If you have a fixed exchange rate, a devaluation refers to a decrease in the official value of the currency. You're taking that target exchange rate and you're shifting it down. That's what that says. So the E, the number of foreign per domestic, is being dropped. So a devaluation it's a reduction or a drop in the official or target exchange rate. Okay? A revaluation is the opposite. A revaluation would see the target exchange rate be shifted upwards. So devaluation, a decrease in the target value. The number of foreign per domestic dropping. A revaluation is an increase in the official target value. The number of foreign per domestic is rising because the curve would be shifting upwards. Okay? So suppose a country, we'll call them home, the home country adopts a fixed exchange rate, and they've decided to devalue their currency. They're shifting that curve downwards. When the domestic currency is devalued, this makes domestic goods less expensive. It makes them less expensive abroad. It also makes them less expensive at home, relatively speaking. And so when the domestic currency is devalued, domestic goods are less expensive abroad, so exports rise. They're also less expensive at home relative to imports, so imports fall. And both of these reinforce making the trade balance rise. Of course, when net exports rise, our planned expenditure line shifts up, and in our income expenditure model, that results in an increase in GDP in short-run equilibrium. So this devaluation makes the economy expand to have more economic activity. More output means more jobs in the short run and less unemployment. Okay? So this is an emergency measure to expand the economy. Notice the phrase I just said, it's an emergency measure. It's kind of like if you're ever on a public transit and you look over at the streetcar or the subway train or the bus, and there'll sometimes be a thing that says, break a glass and pull lever in case of an emergency, or push on this and make the train come to emergency stop. But you only do these things in an emergency. You don't do them when the train is traveling normally, because it's dangerous to have the train come to a sudden stop. People could fall down and get hurt and things like that. This is an emergency measure that the central bank has at its disposal in case the economy has some severe troubles. Okay? So when countries devalue or revalue, they tend to do small shifts. They don't do a huge one. You don't slam on the brakes and cause the vehicle to crash. Okay. So let's take a look at a numerical example for our open economy. So the numerical example is the same as we saw in week number 11. And I'll heavily isolate or identify the exchange rate here is fixed at 1. The number of foreign per domestic, 1. So our consumption function, our taxes, our transfers, our planned expenditure line, interest rate fixed at 2%, government spending, export function, import function. Okay? Using all this information, the initial exchange rate of 1, the initial fixed interest rate of 2%, we get our disposable income as a function of y. We plug into the consumption function to get our consumption function as a function of y. And then we plug everything together. Consumption function plus investment function plus g plus x minus imports to get our planned expenditure line. Set income equal to expenditure, right? So set y equal to this and solve for y. Y is 3,800. That's our short-run equilibrium level of GDP. At that level of GDP, we plug that back into here, and we can get imports, given that exchange rate and the y. And net exports, which is exports minus imports, is minus 390. So we have a trade deficit of 390 in our initial equilibrium. And again, the exchange rate right now is fixed. So fixed exchange rate. Suppose we devalue. So the domestic currency has been devalued. Instead of an exchange rate of 1 for 1, it's been devalued by 0.25 foreign currency per domestic currency. That means now that the new official exchange rate is 1 minus 0.25. Now the new official exchange rate is 3/4 of a foreign currency unit per domestic. That's that shift downwards of that line. The height used to be 1, now the height is 0.75. Right? And yes, we can calculate our autonomous aggregate expenditure, we can calculate our planned expenditure line, just like always. As usual, there's two ways to find the impact here. We can go the long route, or we can use the multiplier route, the short route. They both agree, of course. So let's take our time and show that they do. So when the domestic currency has been devalued by 0.25 foreign currency per domestic goods become less expensive. Exports will go up, imports will go down. Oh, what's the change in exports? Well, it's going to be minus that X1 coefficient times the change in the exchange rate. So minus 15 times, well, the exchange rate dropped by 0.25%. Don't forget the minus. That minus times that minus gives us a positive, and we have 1/4 of 15 is 3.75. The change in imports IM2 times the change in the exchange rate. Well, that's 25 times, don't forget the minus, because now the minus will be here. And we have a quarter of 25 times minus 1. We get minus 6 1/4. So the change in autonomous aggregate expenditure is the change in exports minus the change in imports. Remember, imports are being subtracted. And so there's a negative there, but there's a negative there. That now becomes positive. Add those two together. Autonomous aggregate expenditure rose by 10. So when we calculate the planned expenditure line, we used to have a coefficient of 1900. Now we have plus another 10. So income equals expenditure, solving for y. The new y is 3820. Y in equilibrium went up by 20 units. Again, that's the long route. And it was easy to see because autonomous aggregate expenditure went up by 10, and the multiplier is 1 over half. That's the short route. The change in y is the change in autonomous aggregate expenditure, the 10, times the multiplier. So 10 times, well, 1 over a half is just 2, 20. The new y is 20 higher. Okay? I will also acknowledge plugging in the new exchange rate. There's the new exports. There's the new imports. Of course, you got to plug in the new y, 3820. And so our new trade balance is minus 382. We have a smaller trade deficit than before. Previously, the trade deficit was minus 390. So this devaluation has helped y grow by 20, and it's made our trade deficit smaller. Now let's take a look at monetary policy under a floating exchange rate. And let's start with the stuff that was already in the slides before we move on to new goodies. So monetary policy, a floating exchange rate. Monetary policy is effective under a flexible exchange rate regime because we're allowed to change the money supply. It will result in a change in output. So here's our example. Expansionary monetary policy with the flexible exchange rate regime. So the central bank is going to increase the money supply. So if I run the central bank, I can go out and buy some bonds in the open market and send some money under circulation. When I buy bonds, I'm paying for those bonds with money. So more money is being injected out into the economy. So the money supply is rising. And when I'm buying bonds, the price of bonds is rising and the interest rate on bonds is falling because they move inversely. So I'm tugging down the interest rate. We saw that in the past. So the cost of borrowing is falling, and that increases the amount of planned investment, which we've also seen in the past. Also, since the interest rate has dropped, today's consumption becomes less expensive relative to future consumption. The cost of borrowing to have a big screen TV to watch, the basketball on or something like that is cheaper now, right? If interest rates have dropped. So today's consumption becomes less expensive relative to the future consumption. Consumption rises. So this increase of planned investment, this increase of consumption, that's pushing up planned aggregate expenditure. That's shifting the 80 curve to the right, and it's resulting in an increase of y in the short run. We saw all of that for the closed economy. Of course, right now we're talking about an open economy, and that's what happens after this, is the additional dynamics or the additional stuff that goes on when the economy is open. So in an open economy, when the interest rate declines, thanks to that increase in the money supply, there's some more effects here, not just this effect and this one. When the interest rate declines, domestic assets become less attractive than foreign assets. And so the export of assets drops, capital inflows drop, and the demand for domestic currency drops. The import of assets rises because foreign assets look better. And so capital outflows rise. And that means more people are selling domestic currency on the foreign exchange market. Because if I want to buy Japanese assets or European assets or Chinese assets, I have to first sell Canadian dollars and convert into Chinese yuan or, euros or whatever. Okay? So again, the demand for domestic currency is dropping. The supply of domestic currency is rising on the foreign exchange market. Now think about those. The demand for domestic currency is dropping. That's putting downward pressure on the exchange rate. The supply of domestic currency is rising. That's putting downward pressure on the exchange rate. Hey, both of these shifts are pushing the exchange rate to depreciate. The nominal exchange rate is depreciating. Okay? As, of course, the nominal exchange rate depreciates, now domestic goods become less expensive versus foreign goods. We export more. And we import less. So this is due to the change in the exchange rate. The exchange rate effect matters. And the exchange rate is moving here thanks to the movement of interest rates, which alter capital flows, which, like I said, in turn change the exchange rate. This is making the trade balance rise. That's pushing up net exports. So is that pushing up net exports? And that shifts the planned expenditure line further upwards. This had an upward shift. The closed economy features. The open economy features means the curve shifts even further up, which means the 80 curve shifts further to the right. And that means the Y is increased even more. It's that floating exchange rate that allows this additional stuff, that additional effectiveness. We can see that through numerical examples, for example. Examples for example. Hey, there's a nice circularity, Jack. We can see that through numerical examples. Let's investigate. So here's our flexible exchange rate. Exchange rate right now in equilibrium is 1. Interest rate is 2%. Use all this information. We found our initial planned expenditure line, just like earlier, and our initial equilibrium in the income expenditure model, 3,800. And now we're going to do expansionary monetary policy. Initially, we're not going to change the E. We just want to see what happens from changing the money supply. So the central bank lowers the interest rate by 0.5 percentage point. So the interest rate used to be 2%. Now it's 1.5. Okay? And so when the interest rate is now dropped by 0.5 percentage point, we have a lower cost of borrowing. We have an increase in planned investment. We got our interest rate sensitivity times the change in the interest rate. So our minus 5,000 times the change in the interest rate. Remember, it was a 0.5 percentage point. That's got 0, 0. That's where we got the 0.5 percentage point. Don't forget the minus because this dropped by. I got minus and minus. I get a positive number. And thank goodness for calculators. This number times that number gives us 25. So planned investment spending rose by 25. Autonomous aggregate expenditure rose by 25. That used to be our planned expenditure line, had an intercept of 1900. Now it has an intercept that's 25 higher because the curve has shifted up by 25 at NAY. Setting income equal to expenditure, so setting Y equal to this, our new Y will be 3850. Y went up by 50, which made sense again because the multiplier is 2. This coefficient went up by 25. Y went up by 2 times 25. Right? So output is up by 50. Remember, that's only part of what's going on here because we've not changed the E yet. Now let's take a look at including the change of E. So expansionary monetary policy, now taking the change of E into consideration. The central bank has lowered the interest rate by 0.5 percentage point, yes. And that in turn causes the domestic currency to depreciate to 0.75. So this was given, so was the second part. So both I and E have changed here, and that's going to change this, it's going to change this, it's going to change that. So the cost of borrowing is down, we know planned expenditure is up. We already saw that, 25. But the depreciation of the exchange rate means domestic goods are less expensive. We export more. That's our 3.75, the number we calculated on a previous slide. And when the domestic currency depreciates, domestic goods are less expensive, we import less. And imports drop by 6.25. Again, a number we calculated on a previous slide. So the overall change in autonomous aggregate expenditure is the change in planned expenditure, 25, plus the change in, so 25, plus the change in exports, 3.75, minus the change in imports, we got minus, that gets added. And so autonomous aggregate expenditure has gone up by 35. It's gone up by more than before now that we have this additional oomph coming from the exchange rate effect. Now our planned expenditure line, instead of having 1900 as the coefficient, it's now 35 bigger. Set income equal to expenditure, solve for y. The new equilibrium y is 3870. Y went up by 70. It went up by greater amount than previously thanks to the exchange rate effect that caused the planned expenditure line to shift further up, caused the 80 to shift further to the right. So initial equilibrium, interest rate effect, exchange and interest rate effect. Because the floating exchange rate allows this final row, we have an additional stimulus from this expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy made y rise by a whole 70 rather than by 50 only if there was only an interest rate effect. Okay? All righty. Let's take a look at monetary policy when you got a fixed exchange rate. Monetary policy is not effective when you have a fixed exchange rate because the exchange rate is fixed. It's like the children's story about the little boy in the Netherlands who is walking by the dike and the dike is leaking. He puts his finger in the dike and plugs the leak. But if 50 meters away there's another leak, he can't take his finger out and go over to the other leak and plug that at the same time. He can only plug one thing at a time. Unless the two leaks are side by side, he can do them, He doesn't have the power to plug two leaks 50 meters apart with only himself. Monetary policy is sort of the same idea. When you have a fixed exchange rate regime, monetary policy is busy keeping the exchange rate fixed. If somebody sort of calls up the central bank and says, we need you to do monetary policy to manipulate the unemployment rate or to impact the inflation rate, they say, sorry, I'm busy keeping the exchange rate fixed, talk to you later, and hang up on you because they're busy. So monetary policy is being used up right now to keep the exchange rate fixed. Monetary policy cannot be used to change GDP or unemployment or the inflation rate. It's one tool and can be used to do only one thing. So here's our example, expansionary monetary policy, fixed exchange rate. We'll start with the closed economy first, do the mechanics. So an increase in the money supply tugs down the interest rate. Remember, I go and buy bonds and push money into circulation. Yay, the money supply went up. When I bought the bonds, the price of bonds went up and the interest rate on them went down. So I'm tugging down interest rates. When the cost of borrowing declines like this, we get more planned investment. When the cost of borrowing declines like this, today's consumption is cheaper than it used to be relative to future consumption, so we consume more today. We don't delay a car purchase or something like that. And this cause our planned expenditure line to shift upwards, cause our AD curve to shift to the right, and cause the short run equilibrium level of GDP to rise. So in our closed economy, this increase in the money supply is expansionary. More economic activity, more jobs, less unemployment. Now we alter the story so that we now have the open economy. Well, when you have the open economy, the decline of the interest rate makes domestic assets look less attractive. And that means we export less assets and we have less capital inflows. The demand for domestic currency falls. When you're having a capital inflow foreigners have to buy Canadian dollars to flow capital into Canada. If a foreigner wants to buy stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange or bonds in the Canadian bond market, these assets are sold in Canadian dollars. So when there's financial capital inflows, that represents situations where people are demanding domestic currency on the foreign exchange market. But if less capital is flowing in, there's less demand. Similarly, our domestic interest rate went down, but foreign interest rates did not. Domestic assets look less attractive relative to foreign assets. That means we import more of those superior foreign assets. Capital outflows rise. There's more selling of the domestic currency on the foreign exchange market because I have to sell Canadian dollars to buy, European currencies or Asian currencies or American dollars to buy assets in those jurisdictions. And so both of these are making the domestic currency depreciate. And it's now deviating, because E is dropping, it's now deviating away from the official exchange rate. We're seeing a situation where we start at A, right? And then the central bank has increased the money supply, caused the interest rate to drop, and it's making the demand for domestic currencies fall. So we're starting at A, the demand for domestic currencies fall. That's shift number one, pushing us down towards B, because the supply of domestic currencies have risen, pushing us to this curve. So point B would be our new equilibrium. Both this first shift and that first shift are putting downward pressure on the exchange rate. The nominal exchange rate has depreciated. The central bank has to stop this depreciation if they want to maintain the fixed exchange rate. And so the central bank is forced to go out into the foreign exchange market and say, gosh, I'm going to shift this demand curve way up here. We're going to go right there to point C, to where that new demand curve intersects the newer supply curve at the desired exchange rate. So the central bank is buying domestic currency on the foreign exchange market and selling foreign currency. That's shift number two here. That, of course, means the money supply is falling. I laugh. Why did I laugh? Because I'll remind you, at the beginning of this process, the money supply went up. But to defend the exchange rate, I have to lower the money supply. And while I'm lowering it, of course, I'm shedding foreign currency reserves because I'm selling foreign currency. Right? So I'm depleting my reserves somewhat, and the money supply is dropping back towards where it was before. Overall, the money supply will go back to where it started. I don't have the ability to increase the money supply. Just like that little kid doesn't have the ability to put his finger in the hole and 50 meters away put another finger in the hole. Right? He can only plug one hole. And so I don't control the money supply. I can't manipulate it. The money supply is busy keeping the exchange rate fixed. So again, the central bank is forced to stop that depreciation by buying domestic currency to push the exchange rate back up. And of course that means they're selling foreign currency. The money supply is dropping back to its initial level, so that the interest rate is rising back to its initial level, and that makes the capital flows stop. These capital inflow and outflow changes stop. Overall, when all the dust settles, the interest rate's back to where it started, which means investment's back to where it started, consumption's back to where it started, the exchange rate's back to the fixed exchange rate, so exports and imports are back to where they started. That means the planned expenditure line hasn't moved overall. That means the aggregate demand curve hasn't shifted overall, and that means there's been no change of Y. This expansionary monetary policy was not able to actually expand the economy. Unfortunately, though, we burned off foreign currency reserves. And we need those to keep the exchange rate fixed. So if I was in charge of the central bank and the Prime Minister called up and said, hey, Jack, I want you to increase the money supply to increase GDP and make jobs, I'll say, sorry, buddy, I can't do that because our fixed exchange rate means it's impossible. I can't meet both of those objectives simultaneously. Okay? Okay, why don't we take a break? All right. So now we're going to talk about fiscal policy. We showed that monetary policy was only effective under a floating exchange rate environment, but not a fixed exchange rate environment. Now we're going to take a look at fiscal policy under a flexible exchange rate regime. And so fiscal policy has less effectiveness when the exchange rate floats than in the case when it's fixed. That's what we're going to see. So fiscal policy will lead to a smaller change in output in the short run when you've got a flexible exchange rate regime. So again, expansionary policy and flexible exchange rate. So the government decides to increase government spending on goods and services. When G goes up, when there's an increase in government spending on goods and services, the planned expenditure line shifts up, the 80 curve shifts to the right, and the short run equilibrium level of GDP rises. We've seen that in the past. There are crowding out effects though. If G goes up by, a billion, and it's pushing Y up, and there's a multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is somewhat muted by the crowding out. When Y is going up, there's an increase in the demand for money. More income means more money demand, and that puts upward pressure on the interest rate. Because if people are holding on to money, and more money being a non-interest-bearing asset, that pushes up the interest rate. And again, we've seen that in the past as well. So the cost of borrowing has gone up, and that crowds out planned investment spending. And when the interest rate rises and the cost of borrowing has gone up, today's consumption is more expensive relative to the future. Something, if I buy a $10,000, massive big screen TV for my home, or a $40,000 car, and I finance that, then I have to pay a lot more with the higher interest rate in the future to pay off that loan. And so today's consumption is more expensive relative to future consumption, and so the higher interest rate crowds out consumption spending. So yes, G went up, stimulating an increase of GDP, but when the interest rate's rising thanks to the increase of G, investments being crowded out, consumption's being crowded out. Okay? Those are the things that we saw with a closed economy. Now let's remind ourselves, though, the economy is open. In an open economy, so again, repeating ourselves, we saw these effects even in a closed economy. In an open economy, though, the increase of the nominal interest rate makes domestic assets more attractive, and we export more assets. And that leads to greater capital inflows and a greater demand for the domestic currency on the foreign exchange market. The demand curve for the domestic currency is shifting to the right. More people in other countries are buying domestic currency in order to buy these assets that we're exporting. Right? There they are, exporting. Similarly, since domestic assets are more attractive, importation of assets declines because foreign assets don't look so good. Capital outflows decline, and the supply of domestic currencies decline. The supply of domestic currencies shifts to the left, up and over to the left like that. Both of these shifts are doing the same thing, pushing up the exchange rate in equilibrium. Well, we don't necessarily have the intersection right in line like that. It depends on the sizes of these shifts. But they both unambiguously make the exchange rate appreciate. So the domestic currency appreciates. One domestic currency unit is worth more foreign currency units than before because of the number of foreign per domestic. Okay? So the domestic currency has appreciated. And so now domestic goods are more expensive. That crowds out exports. There's another crowding out. This is an open economy crowding out thanks to the exchange rate. And it makes domestic assets, look more expensive relative to foreign, so we import more. Both of these effects make net exports fall. So we have consumption being crowded out thanks to the higher interest rate. We've got investment being crowded out thanks to the higher interest rate. And we've got net exports being crowded out because the higher interest rate caused a nominal exchange rate appreciation. That makes the planned expenditure line shift down, due to the interest rate and exchange rate effects. This shift downwards is fighting the shift upwards, making the increase of Y not nearly as big. So this subsequent decrease in planned aggregate expenditure will partially offset the initial increase in planned aggregate expenditure coming from the increase of G. Overall, then, the planned expenditure line went up, AD curve shifted to the right, but by a smaller amount than when the economy was closed, because we got this additional crowding out coming from the exchange rate effect. So Y went up a bit, didn't go up as much. And we can see that through numerical situations or examples. So here we are with flexible. There's our consumption function, taxes, transfers, investment that's planned, interest rates fixed at 2%, G, exports, initial exchange rates 1, and imports. Take all this information, and there's our planned aggregate expenditure line. Again, initial exchange rates 1, interest rates 2%. Equilibrium Y, 3,800. And so now we're going to have our expansionary fiscal policy. We're not going to change the interest rate or the exchange rate yet. We're just going to change the G. So G went up by 50. So government spending increases by 50, so change of G is 50. So the increase in autonomous aggregate expenditure is 50. The planned expenditure line, instead of having a coefficient at 1900, now has a coefficient at 1950. Right? Same slope, of course. Setting income equal to expenditure, the new Y is 3,900. Y went up by 100. Of course, 50 times 2. The multiplier is 1 over this. Okay? So the multiplier is 2. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at this expansionary fiscal policy with the interest rate changing, but E is still fixed. So now we're seeing the interest rate effect. So again, G went up by 50. This caused the interest rate to rise by half a percentage point. That's a given in this question, right? Thanks to the increase in money demand. Okay? So government spending went up by 50. The cost of borrowing went up by half a percentage point. Planned investment drops. What's the change in planned investment? Well, we have our interest rate sensitivity times the change in the interest rate. So minus 5,000 times the fact that the interest rate went up by a half a percentage point. So 0.005. Planned investment dropped by 25 units. It dropped because of the higher interest rate. So overall, the change in autonomous aggregate expenditure, the change of G plus the change of planned investment. 50 minus 25. Autonomous aggregate expenditure only went up by 25. Our new planned expenditure line isn't 1950 plus a half, it's 1925 plus a half because of that crowding out. Right? Setting income equal to expenditure, our new Y in equilibrium is 3850. Not 3,900, 3850. 25 times 2, Y went up by 50. 2, of course, being the multiplier in this situation. And now we're going to have the exchange rate effect now snuck into the story as well. So expansionary fiscal policy, the interest rate's changing, and the exchange rate's changing. So G went up by 50. The interest rate went up by half a percentage point, and the domestic currency has appreciated from 1 to 1.2. Okay? Again, this is given to us in this question for us to carry forward and manipulate it. So it's gone up by 0.2. So we're going to take a look at the change of G, the change of planned expenditure, change of the exports from this, change of imports from this. So government spending went up by 50. Cost of borrowing went up. We already know the change of planned investment, that it dropped by 25. The domestic currency appreciated, making domestic goods more expensive. And that's making exports drop and imports rise. And so we have the exchange rate sensitivity of exports times the change of the exchange rate. So minus 15 times 0.2, because we went from 1 to 1.2, so the change of the exchange rate was 0.2. So exports declined by 3. The change of imports, we have the exchange rate sensitivity times the change of the exchange rate. So we have 25 times 0.2. Imports went up by 5. So overall, the change of autonomous aggregate expenditure, change of G, change of planned expenditure, change of exports, minus the change of imports. So 50, take away 25, take away 3, take away 5, because that's minus 5. So take away 5. 17 only. So our new planned expenditure line sees 1900 plus 17. Yes, the line has shifted up, but it didn't shift up by nearly as much because of the exchange rate appreciation, crowding out net exports, because these are tugging down NX. Y went up by only 34. So this little table shows us the overall situation. We can step back and look at the forest or the big picture. Initial equilibrium. Y is 3,800. Exchange rate's 1. Interest rate's 2%. G is 500. Now we have an increase of G of 50 each time. Holding the interest rate frozen and the exchange rate frozen, Y rises by a whole 100 units because there's no crowding out yet. Oh, but wait a second. The increase of G pushes up the interest rate. Let's hold the exchange rate frozen. The higher interest rate crowds out investment and consumption spending. That means that the line didn't shift up nearly as much. It only shifted up a little bit. And that meant that Y only grew by a little bit, only half as much. And again, we've held the exchange rate still frozen. Making the full, more realistic case, G went up, caused the interest rate to rise, and the exchange rate to rise. This crowds out investment and consumption spending. This crowds out net exports. The planned expenditure line shifted up by a little bit, not by a moderate amount, not by a lot, just a little bit. So Y went up only by a little bit. Fiscal policy is less effective because the exchange rate moved. If the exchange rate stayed fixed, then Y would have grown by 50, not 34. So fiscal policy is less effective with the flexible exchange rate than with the fixed. Okay? That's the fixed exchange rate. Right? Y went up by 50. With the flexible, Y went up only by 34. And that was the punchline that we spoke about before. Fiscal policy, less effective with the flexible exchange rate. Y went up only by 34, not by 50. Let's talk about fiscal policy with the fixed exchange rate. So fiscal policy is effective with the fixed exchange rate. Changes in fiscal policy will make GDP fluctuate in the short run, will make employment fluctuate in the short run, and make unemployment fluctuate. So expansionary fiscal policy with a fixed exchange rate. G goes up, planned expenditure line shifts up, AD shifts to the right, Y rises in the short run. And remember the crowding out. When Y went up, money demand's up, causing the interest rate to go up, and the cost of borrowing rises, crowding out planned investment spending. Today's consumption is more expensive relative to future consumption, thanks to the higher interest rate, crowding out today's consumption. Right? Again, those are the closed economy effects. Now sneaking in the open economy additional parts. In an open economy, the increase of the interest rate makes domestic assets more attractive, and we export more assets. We get capital inflows rising, and so the demand for the domestic currency in the foreign exchange market shifts up. We import fewer assets because our own assets are better. There's less capital outflows, and the supply of domestic currency shifts up to the left. Both of these are upward shifts, making the exchange rate appreciate. The domestic currency appreciates and deviates away from the official target exchange rate.
we got a situation like this. Initially, we're at point A. And then G goes up, causing this cascade of effects. The interest rate rises. We're exporting more assets. The demand for domestic currency shifts to the right, to D1, putting upward pressure on the exchange rate. At the same time, we're importing less assets, so there's less capital outflows. There's less supply of domestic currency on the foreign exchange market. And that's also shift 1. Supply is shifting up to the left. B would be our new equilibrium exchange rate if we had a floating exchange rate. We have pressure for the exchange rate here to appreciate. Okay? E is appreciated. Under a fixed exchange rate regime, though, the central bank has to stop that appreciation. They go, oh my gosh, look at this. They say, we need to be on this target. They say, we need to be where the new demand curve meets this target. We need to take that supply curve and shift it over here to S2. And so the central bank says, I need to go out there and sell domestic currency. Supplying means selling. And so the central bank's going to go out and sell domestic currency and exchange it for foreign currency. That means they're buying foreign currency. When they're selling domestic currency, the money supply is rising, and that's pushing the interest rate back down. And we have to keep doing that to push the interest rate until it gets back to its initial level, to stop those financial capital inflows and outflows, to stop the inflows and put the outflows back to their normal levels. Overall, when the dust settles, the nominal interest rate's back to its initial level, which means investment's back to its initial level. It didn't change. A little bar on top means didn't change. That means consumption didn't change. The exchange rate is fixed because we're back at the target exchange rate here at point C. And if the exchange rate didn't change, exports didn't change. Yes, G went up, which made the planned expenditure line shift up, which made AD shift to the right. Y did go up, but there's no crowding out effect of consumption or investment coming from the interest rate change because there is no interest rate change. And there's no crowding out of net exports coming from the exchange rate change because there is no exchange rate change. So, yes, fiscal policy was very, very effective here. Go back to that table we had earlier. Right? If the interest rate didn't change and the exchange rate didn't change, Y really goes up. Right? So maybe I should not put the word fixed there. Fixed goes here where the initial interest rate and the initial exchange rate. Y went up a lot. Right? That's the fixed. Fiscal policy is very powerful, very effective in this circumstance. Right? When the central bank is doing this, think of it, it's selling domestic and buying foreign. This means that their official reserves are actually on the rise. And it also means since they're selling domestic, the money supply is on the rise. Okay? So money supply went up, official reserves went up to maintain that target exchange rate. All righty. Well, one final slide for the term. And that's to mention international business cycles. When you have an open economy, shocks flow over the border. A shock could originate from within the domestic economy, impacting the domestic economy, but it could also spread over the border to other economies. Okay? So we can have business cycles that have an international source or have an international impact. right? We live in a globalized world where, one ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal can have global repercussions because it impacts trade flows of goods all around the planet, even if it's just a delay. So if an open economy experiences changes or shocks coming from the goods market, such as a change of autonomous consumption or autonomous investment, or a change of government spending of goods and services, or a change of taxes, or a change of transfers, those are fiscal policies, a change of autonomous net exports or autonomous imports, right? A flexible exchange rate regime will result in a smaller change in output. Goods market shocks are automatically stabilized by fluctuations in the floating exchange rate. Hey, that's kind of nice. And so Canada has a floating exchange rate, and the Bank of Canada says one of the reasons why we picked this is because we have a large diversified economy, and we don't depend on trade of only one thing with only one economy, and so we can handle exchange rate fluctuations. But they also say that by having a floating exchange rate regime, the floating exchange rate works as an automatic stabilizer in the face of goods market shocks. It means that the business cycle, the short-run fluctuations of employment, unemployment, and GDP are somewhat muted or mitigated thanks to the floating exchange rate. The exchange rate fluctuates so that the real economy doesn't have to. Okay? So with the flexible exchange rate regime, the initial change in consumption or investment or whatever on Y will be offset by subsequent change in planned expenditure coming from changes in the interest rate and exchange rate. When you have a fixed exchange rate regime, there won't be that further change of planned expenditure coming from an exchange rate movement because the exchange rate is forced not to move. Right? So there's no change of the interest rate or exchange rate, and therefore you have bigger fluctuations. Let me go back to that table from a few slides back. This was a change of G, which is a goods market shock, right? A change of G. And when you have the fixed exchange rate, Y fluctuated a lot. When you have the flexible exchange rate, Y fluctuated only a little bit. So the flexible exchange rate works to automatically stabilize GDP. It doesn't fluctuate nearly as much. Okay? Okay, fixed exchange rate, on the other hand, works to minimize fluctuations in output if the shock comes from the market for money. Say changes in money demand. Any change in money demand will be automatically offset by a change in money supply to keep the exchange rate fixed. If you have a flexible exchange rate regime, though, the initial change in money demand on Y is reinforced by a subsequent change in planned expenditure because the exchange rate fluctuated. So money market shocks are reinforced in a floating exchange rate environment, making for bigger fluctuations. Money market shocks with a fixed exchange rate, though, the initial change in money demand on Y is fully offset by an offsetting change in the money supply, so that there's no change in planned expenditure. No change in planned expenditure, no change of Y. So no change of planned expenditure, no change of Y. Coming from a shock originating in the market for money. And so if your country's hit with a lot of goods market shocks, maybe you want a floating exchange rate regime. On the other hand, if your economy's hit by a lot of money market shocks, maybe you want a fixed exchange rate regime. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. Okay? The only slide remaining is the one that says, this is the last slide. I want to remind you guys of a number of things. Standard things that get mentioned in even standard times, pre-COVID times, and of course things that get mentioned now because of COVID. Of course, with COVID, we want you to try and take care of your health. I've been trying to stress this all term. All right? Please spread out your work. I know we're getting close to the finish line. So plan things out. Spread things out, right, so that you're not overwhelmed. If you're facing stresses where you feel that you could get some help, please reach out to the various sources, whether it be academic advising, whether it be the Career Center, whether it be accessibility services, whether it be health and wellness. There's people here to help. Okay? Get the help you need if you need help. Okay? We do care, honest. We're all human beings. We know you are too. Okay? Normal things to get said in any environment. Of course, near the end of the term now, that means that course evaluations are ongoing. Please do spend some time to go and do your course evaluations. At least for my course. I know, okay. Do them for all of them if you can. But I'd really appreciate to hear from you, hear what works and what doesn't, and we'll see what we can do. Okay? Watch Quercus for announcements about office hours during the final exam period. Right? The style of the final exam will be similar to the style with the midterm. That is to say, yes, it's done on Quercus quizzes. Yes, you can only move forwards, not backwards. And yes, we'll have announcements talking about the actual number of questions and things like that as we get closer. I have not finished making the exam, so I don't know the actual number yet. Okay? The exam will have greater emphasis on material not yet tested. Let me repeat that, and I'll put it in writing on a Quercus announcement. But the exam will give greater emphasis to material not yet tested. That means greater emphasis on material since the midterm, especially. Okay? But the material all connects and integrates together. So in some sense, the final is on the whole term, even if we're not asking, the same questions we had on the midterm. Okay? I miss all of you and wish you well. We really do care. Good luck on all of your exams. Thank you.